At 30,000 feet, the B-17 Flying Fortress reveals its true nature. Not as a symbol of strength, but as a place where survival begins to fail before the enemy even appears. The cabin is unpressurized. The air is thin, cold, and hostile. Breathing becomes difficult. Fingers lose feeling, mind slow as oxygen fades. Men fight hypoxia and frostbite while the aircraft shakes and screams around them. This is not enemy fire. This is simply flying the aircraft. Before German fighters appear, before flak bursts fill the sky, bomber crews are already fighting to stay conscious, to stay warm, and to stay alive. For thousands of airmen, the Flying Fortress became their first and last battlefield. The path to becoming a B-17 Flying Fortress crewman did not begin in combat. It began on quiet airfields far from enemy fire, where danger came from rushed schedules, overloaded aircraft, and instructors who knew that time was already running out. In the early years of the war, the United States Army Air Forces expected bomber crews to go through long and careful training. Pilots normally trained for close to 9 months. Navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers followed similarly detailed programs. This was how it was supposed to work. By 1942, that plan had collapsed. The demand for heavy bombers over Europe grew faster than crews could be trained. Losses mounted at an alarming rate. Aircraft were disappearing over occupied territory faster than replacement crews could be prepared. In response, the training pipeline was compressed again and again until what had once taken most of a year was forced into barely 2 months. Pilots who had never flown complex multi-engine aircraft found themselves moving directly from trainers into the cockpit of a fully loaded bomber. Gunners learned to track moving targets from the air after only a handful of hours. Navigators were expected to guide formations across continents after exercises that barely scratched the surface of real conditions. Mistakes that would have once been corrected slowly were now paid for in lives. Training accidents became one of the deadliest parts of the war for American airmen. Around 25,000 airmen died in training accidents during the conflict. Many of them were assigned to B-17 units. The Flying Fortress was the main heavy bomber in the European theater before later aircraft arrived, which meant it dominated the skies during the period when training was most rushed. Long before crews ever encountered German fighters or flak, many were already being buried in American soil. A major source of danger came from formation flying. Early bombing missions revealed a harsh truth: lone bombers were easy targets. Even small groups could be picked apart by interceptors. The solution was mass formations where dozens or even hundreds of aircraft flew close enough to protect one another, with overlapping fields of machine gun fire. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was terrifying. Flying a B-17 was difficult even under ideal conditions. Flying it within yards of other bombers while maintaining exact altitude, speed, and spacing demanded absolute precision. Crews had to learn to hold position for hours without drifting to high or to low. A small error could bring wings or tail surfaces dangerously close to another aircraft. Instructors pushed pilots to tighten formations further as losses increased, turning training flights into constant high-risk maneuvers. Weather made everything worse. Many training bases and operational airfields in Britain were surrounded by fog, low clouds, and unpredictable winds. Bombers took off one after another in rapid succession, sometimes as little as 30 seconds apart. The first aircraft might still be rolling down the runway when the next one began its takeoff run. Engines roared at full power while pilots strained to lift heavy aircraft loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition into the air before running out of pavement. Once airborne, the danger only increased. Crews had to gather in the sky and assemble into large formations, often with limited visibility. To help guide them, special aircraft known as assembly ships were used. These were older B-17s painted in bright patterns with bold markings to make them visible through cloud and haze. Crews followed these unusual aircraft like beacons, trying to slot into their assigned positions without colliding with others doing the same thing. Despite these measures, mid-air collisions were common. Bombers struck one another while maneuvering through clouds or turbulence. A clipped wing or damaged tail at low altitude often meant no chance of recovery. Fully fueled aircraft could erupt into fireballs that scattered debris across the countryside. Many crews never even had time to realize what had gone wrong. Those who survived training and made it overseas discovered that formation flying under combat conditions was even more demanding. During missions, bombers were expected to hold their positions regardless of flak bursts, evasive maneuvers, or damage to their own aircraft. Breaking formation made the entire group more vulnerable. This meant pilots often had to ignore instinct and keep flying straight into danger, while explosions rocked the sky around them. Veterans later said that one of the hardest parts of any mission was not the bombing run or the fighter attacks. It was the initial climb and assembly over England. Taking off in poor weather, then circling and forming up with dozens of other bombers while fully loaded and low on altitude, was described as pure nerve strain. Every second demanded absolute concentration. One lapse could destroy multiple aircraft at once. The training system did little to prepare crews for the physical environment they would face once airborne at altitude. The B-17 was unpressurized. This meant that as it climbed higher, the air inside the aircraft became thinner and thinner. At 20,000 feet, oxygen levels dropped sharply. At 30,000 feet, the human body could no longer function normally without assistance. Breathing felt labored, thoughts slowed, judgment faded. Oxygen systems were installed to keep crews alive, but these systems were far from perfect. Masks leaked, hoses disconnected, valves froze. If oxygen flow was interrupted, a crewman might not even realize what was happening. Hypoxia caused confusion and drowsiness. Men could lose consciousness within minutes. If no one noticed and intervened, they would simply slip away. Cold was the other constant enemy. Temperatures at bomber altitude routinely dropped to around -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft's skin provided little insulation. Wind blasted through open gun positions and seams in the fuselage. Crews wore electrically heated flight suits known as blue bunny suits to survive the cold. These suits were connected to the aircraft electrical system, which meant they depended on wiring that could fail at any time. When the heating worked, it could sometimes overheat, causing burns or extreme discomfort. When it failed, frostbite set in quickly. Fingers lost feeling, toes went numb. Touching bare metal with ungloved hands could tear skin away instantly. Gunners had to operate weapons in these conditions, staring into frozen skies for hours while waiting for enemy fighters to appear. Training rarely captured the reality of this environment. Practice flights were shorter. Aircraft were not always flown at full combat altitude. Crews did not experience the sustained exposure to cold and oxygen deprivation that defined real missions. When men encountered these conditions for the first time during combat, the shock was severe. Equipment failures added another layer of danger. Oxygen systems were deliberately designed to operate at low pressure, so they would not explode if hit by enemy fire. This made them safer in theory, but also more fragile. Walk-around oxygen bottles were carried for emergencies, allowing crewmen to move through the aircraft or survive brief system failures. These bottles provided only a few minutes of air. If the main system failed and a crewman could not reach safety quickly, there were few options. Descending to a lower altitude might restore breathable air, but this was not always possible during combat. Bailing out was the final choice, but doing so at high altitude introduced its own lethal risks. By the time a B-17 crew crossed the English coast on a combat mission, they had already survived a gauntlet of dangers that had nothing to do with the enemy. Rush training had left gaps in experience. Formation flying demanded constant precision under stress. The aircraft itself exposed them to freezing temperatures and oxygen deprivation. Accidents had claimed thousands before a single bomb was dropped over Europe. This reality shaped the mindset of bomber crews. They understood that survival depended as much on luck as skill. Every mission began with hazards that could not be controlled or avoided. The flying fortress was powerful and heavily armed, but it was also unforgiving. It demanded perfect coordination from men who had been trained in record time and asked to perform at the edge of human endurance. As crews climbed higher and deeper into hostile skies, these early dangers did not fade away. They remained present throughout every mission, quietly working alongside flak and fighters to thin the ranks. And once the bombers crossed into enemy airspace, far worse threats were waiting for them. Once the B-17 left the safety of the English coast and began its long climb, the aircraft itself became a hostile place. The bomber was not pressurized. There were no sealed cabins or controlled air systems like those found in later aircraft. As the bomber climbed higher, the air inside thinned at the same rate as the air outside. The crew felt every foot of altitude in their lungs and heads. At 10,000 feet, breathing already felt different. At 20,000 feet, it became work. At 30,000 feet, it became survival. The human body was never meant to function in such conditions. Oxygen levels dropped so low that the brain struggled to stay alert. Movement slowed. Thoughts became dull and unfocused. Without supplemental oxygen, a man could lose consciousness in minutes, Every crew position relied on an oxygen mask. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and engineers were all tethered to hoses that fed them life. These systems were simple by necessity and fragile by nature. Rubber cracked in the cold. Metal fittings froze. Connections loosened under vibration. If a mast slipped or a hose disconnected, the effect was not immediate pain but confusion. Men would forget where they were or what they were doing. Some would feel calm and sleepy just before passing out. Veterans later said this was one of the most dangerous aspects of flying the B-17. Hypoxia did not announce itself clearly. A man might believe he was functioning normally while making deadly mistakes. Pilots might drift off altitude. Gunners might stop scanning their sectors. Navigators might lose track of their calculations. If no one noticed in time, a crewman could be lost without a sound. To reduce the danger, walk-around oxygen bottles were placed throughout the aircraft. These small tanks allowed men to move between stations or survive brief failures. They provided only minutes of air. In theory, that was enough to fix a problem or descend to a safer altitude. In reality, combat rarely allowed calm solutions. If enemy fire damaged the oxygen system, there was often little time to react. Cold magnified every problem. At bomber altitude, temperatures hovered around -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin aluminum skin of the aircraft offered almost no insulation. The interior became a frozen wind tunnel. Open gun ports allowed icy air to blast through the fuselage. The sound of wind mixed with engine noise, creating a constant roar that never stopped. To survive, crews wore electrically heated flight suits called blue bunny suits. These suits were thick, bulky, and stiff. They were plugged into the aircraft electrical system, which powered heating elements woven into the fabric. When the system worked, it kept blood flowing and fingers usable. When it failed, the cold took over fast. Electrical failures were common. Wiring could short out. Connections could shake loose. Battle damage could sever power instantly. When heat disappeared, the body began losing warmth at a dangerous rate. Frostbite could set in within minutes. Fingers became clumsy. Toes lost all feeling. In extreme cases, exposed skin froze solid. Touching metal without gloves was dangerous. Machine guns, ammunition belts, and aircraft frames could tear skin away instantly. Gunners learned never to remove their gloves, even briefly. Still, frostbite was widespread. Many airmen finished missions with blackened fingers or toes. Some lost them entirely. Movement inside the aircraft was difficult even under ideal conditions. The B-17 was cramped. Narrow walkways ran through the fuselage. Crewmen wore heavy suits, boots, gloves, helmets, oxygen masks, and parachutes. Every movement required effort and balance. Turbulence tossed the aircraft constantly. Ice formed on surfaces. Condensation froze where breath met cold air. The psychological strain matched the physical discomfort. Men were forced to remain alert for hours in an environment that actively drained their strength. Gunners stared into empty skies, scanning for fighters that might appear at any moment. Navigators bent over charts with numb hands. Bombardiers lay in the nose of the aircraft, surrounded by glass, knowing they were the first target in a head-on attack. All of this happened before enemy fire became a factor. Simply reaching the target area demanded endurance few had ever experienced. The bomber climbed slowly, taking a long time to reach altitude. During this climb, oxygen use increased, heating systems struggled, and engines were pushed hard. Any mechanical issue early in the mission could force a return or a dangerous attempt to catch up with the formation. The aircraft itself was loud and unforgiving. For engines vibrated constantly, the airframe shook. Communication relied on intercom systems that could fail or be drowned out by noise. Crewmen learned to read body language and gestures when words were lost. Coordination mattered, because a single mistake could cascade into disaster. As the bomber leveled off at altitude and turned toward enemy territory, the environment settled into a deadly routine. Cold, thin air, and constant vibration became the new normal. The body adjusted only slightly. Fatigue accumulated. Concentration wavered. The longer the mission lasted, the harder it became to maintain focus. The design of the B-17 reflected the limits of technology at the time. Pressurization was still experimental during the aircraft development. Designers prioritized range, payload, and defensive armament over crew comfort. The result was a bomber that could absorb punishment but demanded sacrifice from the men inside it. This environment shaped how crews experienced combat. Fear was not limited to moments of attack. It was present from takeoff to landing. Every minute at altitude carried the risk of oxygen failure, heating failure, or sudden loss of consciousness. Men depended on one another not just to fight, but to stay alive. Crew discipline became a matter of survival. Oxygen checks were constant. Heating connections were monitored closely. Crewmen watched each other for signs of hypoxia. A slumped posture or unfocused stare could mean trouble. If a man went silent on the intercom, someone had to investigate immediately despite the cold and danger of moving through the aircraft. Even brief moments without oxygen could have lasting effects. Headaches, memory gaps, and confusion followed many missions. Some airmen experienced long-term health problems after the war. At the time, there was little understanding of these risks. The priority was getting bombers to their targets and back. As the bomber pressed deeper into enemy territory, the physical strain began to intersect with new threats. Flak belts waited ahead. Fighter interceptors would soon appear. The crew had already spent hours fighting cold, exhaustion, and low oxygen. Their strength was not fresh when combat began. It was already worn down. This reality explains why the flying fortress could feel like an enemy as much as a protector. It kept crews alive in the air, but only barely. It demanded constant vigilance, endurance, and discipline just to function. By the time the first black burst of flak appeared in the sky, every man on board had already survived a quiet battle against altitude, cold, and their own limits. And once the bomber crossed into defended airspace, the environment that had tested them so far would become the least of their worries. The first sign that the bomber had entered truly hostile airspace was not a fighter. It was a distant black puff hanging in the sky. Then another. Then dozens more. German anti-aircraft fire announced itself long before it reached the aircraft, but that warning did nothing to soften what came next. Each burst marked the timed detonation of a shell designed to explode close enough to tear an aircraft apart without ever touching it. The German air defense system was vast and carefully organized. Tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns were positioned around cities, factories, rail hubs, and ports. These guns were grouped into defensive belts that bombers had to fly through to reach their targets. Crews knew when they were approaching one of these zones. The sky ahead often looked dirty, as if smeared with dark clouds that were slowly expanding. These were not clouds. They were explosions. The most feared of these weapons was the 88mm gun. Originally designed as an anti-tank weapon, it proved devastating when turned skyward. Its shells were heavy and fast, guided by radar and fire control systems that calculated where bombers would be, not where they were at the moment of firing. The shells burst at altitude, releasing fragments that spread outward in a deadly radius. Inside the B-17, the first flak burst felt distant. The aircraft shuddered slightly as shock waves passed through the air. The sound was dull and heavy, like distant thunder. Crews were trained to hold formation and ignore it. Small course corrections could throw off the bombing run or disrupt the protective formation. So the pilots held steady while the sky grew darker. As the bomber moved deeper into the flak belt, the explosions came closer. The sound changed. Bursts cracked sharply, and fragments rattled against the fuselage like gravel thrown at metal. The aircraft shook harder now. Instruments vibrated. Loose objects jumped and clattered across the floor. The smell of cordite and burned metal sometimes seeped inside. There was nothing the crew could do to fight flak. Machine guns were useless against it. Evasive maneuvers were limited, because sudden movement endangered the formation. Crews relied on luck, altitude changes ordered from command, and the hope that the shells would burst just far enough away. When a shell exploded close enough, the effect was immediate and terrifying. Shrapnel punched through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft with ease. Fragments tore through insulation, wiring, control cables, and flesh. A single burst could wound or kill multiple crewmen at once. Blood froze instantly in the cold air, leaving dark stains on metal surfaces. Survivors described flak wounds as unlike anything else. The fragments were jagged and unpredictable. Men were decapitated. Limbs were torn away. Bodies were cut in half by explosions that never touched the aircraft directly. Those who lived carried the images with them long after the war. The psychological effect was severe. Unlike fighters, flak could not be seen or tracked clearly. It appeared without warning and struck without mercy. Crews flew through fields of explosions, knowing that survival depended on the timing of fuses set by unseen gunners miles below. Veterans later said it felt like flying through a solid wall that might collapse at any moment. Flak vests were issued to protect vital organs. These heavy garments offered some protection against fragments striking the torso. They did nothing for the head, neck, or limbs. Many fatal wounds came from shrapnel that struck the face or throat. Gunners who stood exposed at their positions were especially vulnerable. Despite this, the B-17 gained a reputation for toughness. Crews returned with aircraft that seemed impossible to keep airborne. Entire sections of wings were missing. Control surfaces were shredded. Engines were dead or burning. Yet some bombers limped home on one or two engines, trailing smoke, with holes punched clean through the fuselage. These stories spread quickly through bomber units. They became legends that offered hope and dread at the same time. Hope, because the aircraft could sometimes survive incredible damage. Dread, because no one could count on being one of the lucky ones. As flak belts ended, another danger usually followed: German fighters. Early in the war, American planners believed that tight formations and heavy defensive armament would protect bombers from fighters. The idea was that overlapping machine gun fire would create a lethal barrier. In reality, this theory collapsed quickly. German pilots learned how to exploit weaknesses in the formations and attack from angles that reduced exposure to defensive fire. Fighters approached from above, below, and most dangerously from straight ahead. Head-on attacks gave gunners little time to react. Closing speeds were immense. A fighter could unleash a burst of cannon fire and break away in seconds. Early models of the B-17 lacked strong forward-facing firepower, leaving the cockpit and nose dangerously exposed. German fighters carried powerful weapons. 20mm and 30mm cannons fired explosive shells that tore through aircraft structures. Even a short burst could devastate a bomber interior. Ammunition boxes detonated. Oxygen lines ignited. Crew positions were shredded. The arrival of improved B-17 models brought heavier armament, including chin turrets with twin 50-caliber machine guns. These changes reduced the effectiveness of head-on attacks but did not eliminate the threat. Fighters adapted constantly, experimenting with rockets and new attack patterns. One of the harsh realities of bomber defense was ammunition limits. A fully armed B-17 carried thousands of rounds, but in combat this amounted to roughly 1 minute of continuous firing time. During prolonged fighter attacks, gunners quickly burned through their ammunition. Once the belts ran dry, the bomber was effectively defenseless. Fighter escorts helped, but only partially. Early Allied fighters lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. Aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning could escort bombers for part of the journey, then had to turn back to avoid running out of fuel. Once the escorts left, German fighters moved in aggressively. This created a deadly pattern. Bombers were most vulnerable on the deepest parts of their missions, where targets were most important and defenses strongest. Crews knew this. They watched escort fighters peel away, knowing that the worst was still ahead. Losses mounted quickly. Out of more than 5,000 American heavy bombers lost in combat, roughly half were destroyed by flak and half by fighters. The remaining losses came from accidents and mechanical failures. There were missions where entire formations were shredded in minutes. The most catastrophic example came in the autumn of 1943. Deep raids against industrial targets pushed bomber forces beyond the limits of their protection. On missions to places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, bombers faced relentless fighter attacks after their escorts turned back. German pilots attacked, withdrew to rearm and refuel, then attacked again. The results were devastating. Dozens of bombers were shot down in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed, missing, or captured. The damage inflicted on factories was often repaired within weeks, raising painful questions about the cost of these missions. By this point, bomber crews understood the math of survival. With average losses per mission hovering around 8% and rising much higher on bad days, the odds of completing a full tour were grim. A tour originally required 25 missions. This number was later raised to 30, and then 35. Each additional mission increased the chance that a crew would not return. Only a minority of crews completed their tours. Many were killed. Many were captured. Many were wounded and removed from service. The bomber offensive continued, driven by the belief that it would shorten the war. For the men inside the aircraft, that belief offered little comfort. As flak bursts faded behind them and fighters finally broke off, crews faced the long journey home. Damage had to be managed. Wounded men had to be stabilized. Engines had to be coaxed along. Formation discipline remained critical until the last moment. Even then, danger did not end. Damaged aircraft sometimes crashed on landing. Fires flared unexpectedly. Exhausted crews made mistakes after hours of strain. Survival was never assured until the engines were silent and the aircraft stopped moving. By the time the bomber touched down, the crew had endured freezing cold, oxygen deprivation, flak, and fighters. They had watched aircraft explode around them. They had heard the intercom fall silent as positions were wiped out. They had learned how fragile their existence truly was. And for those whose aircraft did not make it home, an entirely new ordeal was just beginning. When AB-17 could no longer stay in the air, the danger did not end. In many ways, it intensified. Damage that looked survivable from a distance could suddenly become fatal. A burning engine might tear loose. Control cables severed by flak could finally give way. A bomber that had limped along for hours could roll or dive without warning. Inside the aircraft, crews often knew when the situation was beyond saving. Smoke thickened. Fire spread through the wing or fuselage. Instruments failed one by one. The intercom went quiet as wiring burned or crew positions were destroyed. The pilot had to make a decision quickly, because waiting too long meant trapping everyone inside. The bailout alarm was simple and unmistakable. A bell rang through the aircraft, telling the crew to abandon it. In theory, the process was straightforward. In reality, it was chaos. The bomber was rarely flying straight and level when the order came. Many were already spiraling downward, losing altitude fast. Centrifugal force pinned men against bulkheads and floors, making movement almost impossible. Crewmen wore bulky flight suits and parachutes that caught on everything. Narrow passages became bottlenecks. Men shoved past one another, driven by instinct and fear. Some were wounded. Some were disoriented by hypoxia. Others were already dying. Fire and smoke reduced visibility to almost nothing. Statistics later showed that only about half of bomber crews managed to bail out successfully once their aircraft was doomed. Many never reached an exit. Some were trapped by fire or damage. Others lost consciousness before they could escape. A few were struck by debris or hit by the aircraft itself as it broke apart. Those who made it out faced new dangers immediately. Bailing out from high altitude meant exposure to extreme cold and thin air. Parachutes took time to deploy fully. Some men spun uncontrollably during descent. Others blacked out from lack of oxygen before the chute opened. Enemy action did not always stop once a man left his aircraft. German fighters sometimes strafed parachuting airmen. This was widely feared among bomber crews. In response, parachutes were modified to descend faster, reducing the time a man spent hanging helplessly in the air. The trade-off was a harder landing, often compared to jumping from a second-story building. Landing itself could be brutal. Fields, forests, rooftops, and rivers all waited below. Men hit the ground with broken bones, internal injuries, or worse. Parachutes tangled in trees or power lines. Some landed unconscious. Others struggled free while injured and alone in hostile territory. What happened next depended largely on luck and location. Some airmen were quickly captured by German soldiers and taken into custody without incident. Others landed near civilians whose homes and families had been destroyed by bombing raids. Emotions ran high. Nazi propaganda portrayed Allied airmen as terror flyers responsible for mass destruction. In some cases, this hatred turned lethal. Historical records suggest that around 1,000 Allied airmen were killed by mobs before regular forces could intervene. These lynchings were not always reported at the time. The truth often emerged only years after the war. One of the most notorious incidents occurred in the town of Rüsselsheim, where 6 of 8 captured airmen were beaten to death by civilians using stones and tools. Not all perpetrators were punished after the war. Proving individual responsibility was difficult. Some trials were held, but many cases went unresolved. For bomber crews, the fear of what awaited them on the ground added another layer of terror to the idea of bailing out. Those who were captured alive and handed over to military authorities began a long and uncertain chapter as prisoners of war. Injured men were sometimes treated by German medical staff, often with limited resources. Survival depended on the severity of wounds and the availability of care. Prison camps varied widely. Some were relatively orderly. Others were harsh and overcrowded. Food was scarce throughout the later years of the war. Rations dwindled. Disease spread easily. Winters were especially hard on men already weakened by wounds and malnutrition. Roughly 1,300 captured airmen died in captivity from injuries, illness, or neglect. Survivors described long months of hunger, boredom, and anxiety. Many lost enormous amounts of weight. Some were liberated weighing barely 80 pounds, their bodies permanently damaged. While these grim realities define the fate of many crews, a smaller number experienced events so unlikely that they defied explanation. These stories circulated among airmen as whispers of impossible survival, offering fragile hope in an otherwise merciless war. One such incident occurred early in 1943 during a mission over North Africa. A B-17 nicknamed All-American was returning from a bombing run when it was attacked head-on by German fighters. One enemy aircraft lost control and collided with the bomber. Its wings sliced through the tail section, nearly severing it from the fuselage. From another aircraft nearby, a photograph was taken that later became famous. It showed the B-17 flying with its tail hanging at an impossible angle, attached only by torn strips of aluminum and fragments of the floor. The tail gunner position was almost completely detached. By every rule of flight, the bomber should have fallen out of the sky immediately. Control cables to the tail were gone. Structural integrity was destroyed, yet the aircraft stayed airborne. At the moment of impact, the autopilot happened to be engaged. Unlike mechanical controls, it relied on electrical systems and servo motors, some of which remained intact. The pilot used what control he had left to keep the aircraft steady. The rest of the formation slowed down to shield the damaged bomber. Against all expectation, All-American made it back to base and landed safely. The crew suffered no serious injuries. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service, flying missions until the end of the war. Another astonishing survival occurred over France. During a raid on submarine pens, a B-17 named Snap Crackle Pop was hit repeatedly by flak. One engine failed, then a direct hit shattered part of the wing. The aircraft began breaking apart at altitude. In the ball turret beneath the bomber was a 20-year-old gunner. His turret was barely large enough for his body. His parachute was stored inside the fuselage, because it could not fit inside the turret with him. To escape, he would have to rotate the turret, climb inside the aircraft, retrieve the parachute, strap in, and jump. He managed to climb into the fuselage, only to find that his parachute had been shredded by flak. Moments later, another explosion tore the aircraft apart. The blast threw him clear of the bomber without a parachute. He fell from roughly 20,000 feet. The cold and lack of oxygen caused him to lose consciousness. His body fell through the glass roof of a train station, the angle of impact slowing him just enough to survive. German soldiers found him alive among the wreckage, badly injured but breathing. He received medical care and survived. He spent 18 months as a prisoner of war before being liberated in 1945. He lived for decades afterward, never fully understanding how he survived the fall. Similar events happened to others. In one case, a tail gunner was trapped inside a detached tail section after his bomber was destroyed. The section tumbled toward the ground, spinning violently. The gunner accepted what seemed like certain death. The falling wreckage struck trees that absorbed enough force to keep him alive. He was found with severe injuries and survived captivity. In another incident near Greece, a bomber collided with another aircraft in cloud cover. A tail section separated and fell. The gunner inside did not even realize he was alone until he climbed out after landing. He was later sheltered and rescued by local civilians. These stories did not change the overall reality of the bomber war. They were rare exceptions in a campaign defined by loss. But they spread quickly among crews, becoming symbols of the strange and unpredictable nature of survival at altitude. As the war continued, improvements in escort fighters reduced losses from interceptors. Long-range fighters with drop tanks could now accompany bombers deep into enemy territory. This shifted the balance somewhat. Fighter attacks became less deadly, but flak remained constant and unavoidable. The bomber offensive pressed on, driven by strategic necessity and political will. For the men flying the missions, the experience remained brutally personal. Every flight carried the memory of damaged aircraft, falling comrades, and the knowledge that escape offered no guarantee of safety. By the time crews returned from a mission, or failed to return at all, the cost of the air war was written clearly in numbers and faces. Thousands were dead, thousands more were prisoners. Entire cities lay in ruins below. The flying fortress had proven both resilient and merciless. It could bring men home against impossible odds, or kill them without warning. And as the bombing campaign reached its peak, the line between survival and destruction grew thinner with every mission. By the middle of 1943, The bombing campaign over Europe reached a point where belief collided with reality. The belief was that mass formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to any target. The reality was written in the empty beds of airfields across England. Crews were disappearing faster than they could be replaced, and the missions were pushing deeper into Germany than ever before. Targets were no longer near the coast. They were far inland, surrounded by dense flak belts and defended by experienced fighter units. These factories produced ball bearings, aircraft parts, and engines that kept the German war machine alive. Allied commanders believed that destroying them would cripple German industry and shorten the war. To do that, bombers had to fly farther than escort fighters could protect them. The most dangerous part of every mission was now unavoidable. Bombers would be escorted only part of the way. At a certain point, Allied fighters had to turn back to avoid running out of fuel. Crews watched them peel away one by one until only the bombers remained. From that moment on, they were alone. German radar stations tracked the formations as they crossed the coast. Fighter units were scrambled early and held back, waiting for the right moment. When the escorts turned away, the German fighters moved in. They attacked in waves, pulling back only to rearm and refuel, then returning again and again. This tactic drained bomber defenses quickly. Ammunition ran low. Gunners were exhausted. Aircraft damaged in early attacks struggled to stay in formation, becoming easy targets. Each loss made the formation weaker, creating openings that fighters exploited immediately. The breaking point came in August of 1943. On the 17th of that month, Allied forces launched a bold plan. Two separate bomber forces would strike deep into Germany at the same time. One group would attack factories at Regensburg, then continue on to North Africa. The other would strike the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and return to England. The idea was to confuse German defenses and split their fighter response. Weather ruined the plan before it truly began. Poor conditions delayed one force while the other took off on schedule. Instead of arriving together, the two formations were separated by hours. German defenders were able to concentrate on one group, then regroup and attack the second. As the bombers flew beyond escort range, the attacks intensified. Fighters came from every direction, head-on past shredded cockpits. Cannon fire tore through wings and fuselages. Bombers exploded mid-air or spiraled down trailing smoke and fire. By the time the missions ended, the cost was staggering. Out of 376 B-17 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down outright. 90 more were damaged so badly they were written off. Around 600 airmen were killed or missing. Many others were wounded or captured. The damage to the factories was significant, but not decisive. Repairs began almost immediately. Within weeks, production resumed. The price paid in men and aircraft was impossible to ignore. Commanders faced a choice. Scale back deep raids or try again, hoping for a different outcome. 2 months later, they tried again. On October 14, 1943, bombers once more set course for Schweinfurt. This time, nearly 300 Luftwaffe fighters were waiting. Radar detected the formations early. Interceptors were positioned carefully along the route. The result was even worse. Out of 291 bombers, 77 were shot down. 120 more were damaged. Again, roughly 600 airmen were killed, captured, or missing. Entire crews vanished in minutes. Survivors watched friends and aircraft disappear around them with terrifying speed. These two missions became known as Black Thursday. For bomber crews, they marked the moment when faith in the system collapsed. Formation flying and defensive fire were no longer enough. The math of survival had turned brutal and clear. Loss rates on some missions reached nearly 30%. At that level, a crew flying a full tour faced overwhelming odds against survival. Even at average loss rates of 8%, only a small fraction of crews could expect to complete their required missions. Statistics told a grim story. Only about 38% of bomber crews finished their tours. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. In the 8th Air Force alone, around 26,000 airmen were killed and more than 28,000 were taken prisoner. These numbers spread quietly among crews. Men did the calculations in their heads. Every mission felt heavier than the last. The strain showed in faces, voices, and movements. Exhaustion was constant. Fear became routine. Morale suffered. Some crews reached a point where they no longer believed the campaign could continue. Others flew out of duty to their crew, in a sense that stopping would only make past sacrifices meaningless. Commanders recognized that something had to change. Deep penetration raids were temporarily suspended. New tactics were considered. The answer came in the form of long-range escort fighters. Drop tanks extended the range of Allied fighters, allowing them to stay with the bombers much longer. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed the balance completely. With its long range and strong performance, it could escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany and back. When escorts stayed with the bombers, fighter losses dropped sharply. German interceptors were forced into defensive fights. The skies became more contested. The danger from fighters lessened, but it never disappeared. FLAK, however, remained constant. Even as fighter threats declined, bombers still had to fly through dense belts of anti-aircraft fire over every major target. No escort could suppress those guns completely. Crews continued to face the same black burst in the sky, mission after mission. The bombing campaign resumed at full scale. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of bombers filled the sky. Cities and industrial centers were struck repeatedly. The strategy shifted toward massive area bombing, using high explosive and incendiary bombs together to create firestorms. For bomber crews, this meant longer missions, heavier defenses, and the same risks they had always faced. Survival odds improved slightly, but the danger remained ever present. As losses mounted, the human cost became impossible to separate from the mission. Crews watched entire cities burn beneath them. They knew civilians were dying by the tens of thousands. Some struggled with this knowledge. Others shut it out to survive emotionally. The air war took a toll on everyone involved. By late 1943, the bombing campaign had reached a point where it could not be stopped, only endured. Crews continued to fly because the war demanded it, and because turning back was no longer an option. The Flying Fortress had proven its strength, but also its limits. It could carry men deep into enemy territory and sometimes bring them home against impossible odds. It could also deliver them straight into disaster. For those who survived Black Thursday and the missions that followed, the war was no longer about belief or strategy. It was about making it through one more flight. One more climb into the cold. One more passage through flak and fighters. And for those who did not make it back, the story did not end in the air. For many, it continued on the ground in captivity, hunger, and the long wait for a war that seemed determined to consume everything before it was finished. By the final years of the war, the Flying Fortress had become a symbol of endurance, but for the men who flew inside it, endurance came at a terrible price. The bombing campaign continued until the very end, and although losses were reduced by better escorts and improved tactics, danger never disappeared. Every mission still meant hours in freezing air, under constant threat from flak, and the knowledge that one mistake or one lucky shot from the ground could end everything. For crews that survived combat and were shot down, life did not return to normal. Captivity began the moment they touched the ground. Many were injured during bailout or landing. Broken bones, burns, and shrapnel wounds were common. Some were treated by German medics, others by fellow prisoners with almost no supplies. Survival often depended on how badly a man was hurt and where he landed. Prisoner of war camps varied greatly, but none were easy. Food shortages worsened as the war dragged on. Meals were small and lacked nutrition. Men lived with constant hunger. Weight dropped steadily. Illness spread easily in crowded barracks. Cold winters returned year after year, and clothing wore thin. Some camps were moved as Allied forces advanced, forcing prisoners on long marches with little food or rest. Around 1,300 captured American airmen died in captivity. Some from untreated wounds, some from disease. Others from exhaustion and malnutrition. Those who survived often emerged barely recognizable. Many weighed less than 80 pounds when liberated. Their bodies were weak, their immune systems damaged, and their recovery took years. Yet even among this suffering, stories of survival continued to circulate. These were not tales meant to glorify war, but reminders of how unpredictable it had become. Men who should not have lived did so, while others vanished without a trace. One of the most remarkable survivals occurred in February of 1943 during a mission launched from North Africa. A B-17, later known as All-American, was returning from a bombing run when it was attacked head-on by German fighters. One enemy aircraft collided with the bomber as it broke away, slicing through the tail section. From a nearby aircraft, another crew witnessed what looked like certain destruction. The tail of the bomber hung almost completely detached, connected only by twisted strips of metal. The tail gunner position was barely attached. The aircraft should have fallen instantly. Instead, It stayed in the air. The reason was pure chance. At the moment of impact, the autopilot was engaged. While the mechanical control cables were severed, parts of the electrical system remained functional. Using what little control remained, the pilot kept the bomber steady. The rest of the formation slowed to protect it. Against all expectation, the aircraft returned safely and landed. It was repaired and flew again. Another survival bordered on the impossible. During a raid over France, a ball turret gunner found himself trapped as his bomber broke apart. His parachute had been shredded by flak. When another explosion hit, he was thrown clear of the aircraft without a chute. Falling from roughly 20,000 feet, he lost consciousness from cold and lack of oxygen. His body crashed through the glass roof of a train station. The angle of impact slowed him just enough to keep him alive. German soldiers found him badly injured but breathing. He survived his wounds and spent 18 months as a prisoner of war. He lived for decades afterward, never able to explain how he survived the fall. Similar events happened to other airmen. A tail gunner survived after falling inside a detached tail section that struck trees before hitting the ground. Another landed inside wreckage near Greece and was rescued by civilians. These men were not unique in courage or skill. They were simply touched by rare and unrepeatable luck. For every one of these stories, thousands ended differently. By the end of the war, American heavy bombers had dropped around 1.6 million tons of bombs, with the B-17 responsible for roughly 640,000 tons. The effect on German cities was devastating. What began as a campaign focused on industrial targets expanded into area bombing. Entire urban centers were reduced to rubble. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden became symbols of destruction. Firestorms consumed neighborhoods. Tens of thousands of civilians died in single raids. Estimates placed German civilian deaths from bombing between 500,000 and 800,000. More than 120 cities were heavily damaged or destroyed. For bomber crews, this knowledge weighed heavily. Some struggled with guilt. Others shut down emotionally to keep functioning. The scale of destruction below contrasted sharply with the fragile reality inside the aircraft, where men fought simply to stay alive in freezing air. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. Some argue it shortened the war by a year. Others believe the cost in lives was far greater than necessary. What cannot be debated is the human toll paid by the crews who carried it out. By 1945, the war finally ended. Survivors returned home carrying invisible wounds. Many suffered from lasting health problems caused by hypoxia, frostbite, and stress. Nightmares followed them for years. Loud noises triggered memories of flak and engines. Some never spoke about their experiences. The Flying Fortress itself became a legend. It was praised for its durability and firepower. Photographs of damaged bombers returning home filled newspapers and museums. But behind those images were men who endured conditions few could imagine. They trained in a system that rushed them forward before they were ready. They flew unpressurized into extreme cold and thin air. They faced flak that tore bodies apart and fighters that hunted them relentlessly. If shot down, they faced injury, captivity, and sometimes death at the hands of civilians. And still they flew. Not because the aircraft made them safe, but because the war demanded it and because each crew depended on one another. Survival was never guaranteed. It was earned mission by mission, moment by moment, often by nothing more than luck. The real horror of the B-17 was not only the destruction it delivered, but the price paid by those inside it. Men climbed into the Flying Fortress knowing the odds, knowing many would not return, and knowing that even if they survived, the experience would follow them for the rest of their lives. That is what it was really like to be a Flying Fortress crewman.